Hey YouTube, this is Jared with the most passionate show on YouTube about taxes. Today we're going to answer the question, what if my spouse lied about paying our taxes? And this relates to the question we had last week about injured versus innocent spouse, or our last episode rather. And we're going to answer this so you can stress less about your tax issues and you can sleep better at night. So stick around and we'll answer that question in about 2 minutes. But first, a little bit about the show. My name is Jared, and this is my YouTube show about taxes, personal finances, debt, all sorts of things that are kind of related to that area of finance and tax. So I answer people's questions about tax and sometimes kind of other kind of ancillary regions of finance, that kind of stuff. We also occasionally give away free stuff along with free information, free resources, and we occasionally bring other people onto the show to interview. The reason we do this is because I work in this area. I work in tax. I'm a tax advisor, and I kind of in my career kind of stumbled into the area of collections and advising on tax issues around that. And that happened because I had some friends and family who got on the wrong side of the IRS, actually because of some things that some other professionals did wrong. And I kind of saw how there was a need for specialists who focused in this kind of thing. And because of that, I ended up hanging out my shingle for just this. I had done a little bit of it before. I had some specialized training, but I had been doing a lot of other stuff, and I really decided that I wanted to focus down and just be known for this. And that was also a little bit easier because just because there wasn't as many people in my area who were doing this in particular. And because of that, I got to specialize. Now, the only other kind of thing that we'll go over before we do this is just that, yeah, actually, that's pretty much it as far as the intro to the show. If you got any questions, make sure to leave them below. We guys have a question at the end as well for you guys to talk about. So stay tuned for that as well. So now we'll answer the question, what if my spouse lied about paying our taxes? And this relates to the innocent spouse that we talked a little bit last week. And remember, innocent spouse, when we talk about innocent spouse, we're talking about when your spouse maybe lies to you, or you weren't really liable you make the argument that you weren't liable for the tax debt when by default you would be. So you got to use the money, or your spouse got to use the money, and you filed a joint return. That's when you would be filing for innocent spouse. Injured spouse is when it's just your spouse's tax debt from a return they didn't file with you. That's what we're talking about when the liability is different. And they're not going to get into the nitty-gritty details, but that's the high level of it. So when we talked about innocent spouse, we were talking about like when maybe your spouse overstated deductions on a business on like a Schedule C, and then they get audited, and then you owe more tax. That's the kind of thing where you would apply for innocent spouse potentially. Now, this is another situation where you might apply for innocent spouse. And we do these questions this way so they're easy to find. So sometimes you might see that we answer a question more than once in different ways. And we do that so people can find the information better. And usually there's a little bit of a different take on it depending on kind of how, depending on some of the nuances of that particular question. But in this case, if your spouse didn't pay taxes they said they were going to, or your former spouse, sometimes if you're getting divorced, said they were going to pay taxes and then you got divorced, there's the potential for an innocent spouse claim, or one of the flavors kind of innocent spouse. There's equitable relief, separation of liability. There's a bunch of different kinds. And this kind of situation where they said that they were going to pay it and then they didn't is one of the potential criteria for innocent spouse relief. So keep that tucked away in the back of your head. And remember, again, the difference between innocent spouse and injured spouse is if your spouse had a debt that was never yours or could never even potentially be considered yours, usually from a return that they didn't file with you and the IRS is trying to take your refund. That's different from, I have the tax assessed against me, I owe the tax, and now I'm trying to get the IRS to say I don't owe the tax. So does that make sense? So if it shows up on your transcript, more than likely, you're going for innocent spouse. If it's just on your spouse's IRS file and they're trying to take your withholding to pay for it, That's injured spouse. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, today we're answering the question, what if my spouse lied about paying our taxes? So this happens sometimes where spouses will say, oh yeah, I paid it. And then maybe they'll put it in the business because the business is tight and they don't want to admit what's going on. Or maybe they just did something with the money. Or maybe they decided not to pay it after they got divorced because they just didn't. Sometimes divorces are nasty and people break promises. There's all sorts of kind of reasons why this could happen. But the key thing is to remember that potentially you can qualify for innocent spouse. And again, we're going to have a more in-detailed kind of conversation about this. I mentioned it last week. Tom Groth, who's an attorney down in Connecticut, he's a real kind of expert in this area for what he does. It's one of the areas he really specializes in as far as his practice of law down there. So we're going to have him on, and we're going to talk about this in kind of some real detail to help people get an understanding of what the potential is, and we'll probably talk about some case studies as well, so people will kind of see it in action how it works out. So that'll help, and we'll have those eventually. The only other thing is, if you find this helpful, subscribe. We'll get you some good information, help you kind of understand what's going on, sift through some of the bad information that's out there on the internet regarding some of this stuff. And as always, if you got a question, leave it below. And there's a good chance that if we see that question, we'll fire up the camera. We'll answer it right that day. And you'll get a shout out if you want it. If you don't, just let us know. Sometimes people, want it to be a little more private. But other than that, just leave that down below. And then we've got our question for the day. And that's, I have my personal opinions on this, and I help people with this, and Tom helps people with this. But what do you think? Do you think people should be able to get relief based on the fact that their spouse lied about paying the tax? I mean, in a lot of cases, they had access to the money. They had access to they probably used the money to support their lifestyle, or their spouse did potentially. That's kind of the other side of the coin. As far as, how I advise on this stuff, this is the law. My personal feelings don't come into it a whole lot when I'm advising a client, and that's just kind of appropriate professional boundaries. But I'm curious what you guys think about it. What do you think about the ability to kind of make that assessment go away, not based on the fact that you didn't owe the money, but based on the fact that your spouse kind of said they paid the money? Do you think that's fair, or that's right? What are your thoughts on that? That's all for this week. And next week we're going to talk about, let's see, what are we going to talk about next week? Oh, here we go. Oh, next week we're going to talk about, I've heard the question before. I haven't filed my taxes in years. And I haven't heard anything from the IRS. Did they forget about me? This is a question I get sometimes. People say, I haven't filed in 2 or 3 years, 4 years. I haven't heard anything. And then they go, well, I guess I didn't really have to worry about that. So we'll talk a little bit about the dynamics of that and what happens, kind of the process of what happens when you don't file for several years. So you can get some good information about that in particular. Again, if you've got any questions, leave them below. And that's all. I look forward to seeing you guys next episode. Have a great night.